Now we have Drew talking about put the docs cart before the standards horse.
Morning. Yeah. Putting the docs cart before the standards horse. I'm here representing the WordPress open source project. Basically, this talk is going to cover how we basically took 10 years of inline documentation and developed a standard from it instead of the other way around. Thus, the docs cart in front of the standards horse. The why and how of how we developed a standard, and the effects on the docs team and how that raised our profile in the core project. And then where we are now. So, a little bit about me. I'm Drew Jaynes. I work at a distributed WordPress agency called 10up. And 10up donates a significant portion of my time to working on the WordPress open source project, for which I'm the current docs committer. So let's talk a little bit about the backstory of how WordPress approaches inline documentation. Essentially, up until about 8 months ago, WordPress didn't really adhere to an inline documentation standard. They pretty much just followed the PHP doc 1.0 spec loosely, but not officially. And so there was a very kind of loose idea of what inline documentation in WordPress core should look like. So we essentially have 10 plus years of precedent to deal with in the idea of, oh, maybe we should create an inline documentation spec 10 years in. The issue really was that the codex was seen as largely seen as the entry point for all developers and users up until very recently. So some of you may be stepping back and going, okay, so how is that possible? You have 260,000 lines of code, and about a year ago we had something like 60,000 lines of inline documentation. How is it possible that the codex, a wiki, is the primary entry point for developers and users? Let's talk a little bit about the codex. The codex is a 2,300 page manually curated wiki. And what this means is that every time a new version of WordPress comes out, the docs team has to get together and make a master checklist of all the pages in the codex that need to be updated. So if there's a function change, we manually update that. If there's a method, class, API change, we manually update that. And as things were progressing up to about last year, suddenly the WordPress project was iterating much faster, and that meant that the docs team was iterating on the codex much faster. So we were actually getting to the point where we were releasing a new version of WordPress every 3 months, and that meant creating the checklist every 3 months and running through the codex sprint every 3 months. And it was becoming unsustainable. We really needed something better. So enter hook docs. Remember I said before that we had loosely followed the PHP doc 1.0 spec up until about 8 months ago? Well, essentially what happened is we decided, oh, we want to document a section of the WordPress code base that had never been documented before. The problem with that is that there was no actually existing spec anywhere that would sort of give us guidance on how to document these hooks and filters in WordPress core. So we had a decision to make. We had to decide whether to take an existing spec like PHP doc or the PHP Fig PSR standards and try to fit our documentation into that box, or what we ended up doing is creating our own spec, largely inspired by existing specs, and adding our own sort of flavor to it. And that was because we wanted to document the hook and filter architecture in WordPress, but there was no spec for that. So the interesting thing is that we actually ended up developing an inline documentation standard for our hook docs, but in the end we ended up developing the full inline documentation standard because of the hook docs. So that it's funny that something like that ended up being the impetus for why we've suddenly got organized. And it was mostly because we expected there to be a huge influx of contributors coming into the docs team, and we wanted to make sure that there was a baseline for why, how you would document a hook in core, and so it wouldn't end up just being a willy-nilly thing that, like the rest of core up until this point. So let's rewind a little bit back to June of 2013. Around this time, WordPress core had gone through a bit of a shift, and they'd started actually sort of splitting off and recognizing the various contributor groups in WordPress. And so the really cool part about this is that the docs team sort of became its own specific entity. And the cool part about that is that we get our own blog, and we have sort of a home base of where we can say, our chat, we have our weekly chat, and it's on X day at X time in X room. But we also had a place to sort of organize everything together. And at the same time, I don't know how many of you here are familiar with the Open Help Conference in Cincinnati, but we actually ended up using the Open Help Conference last year as a sort of informal summit of our docs team. We managed to get something like 10 members of the docs team together in the same room for the first time ever. And in celebration of that, we decided to go through the Codex survey that we sent out. We had something like 1,500 responses of usage survey of the Codex. And we decided that we wanted to develop a roadmap for documentation going forward in the WordPress project. And let me just say something about roadmaps. Never underestimate the power of a docs team armed with a roadmap. Because we were off to the races as soon as we had it. Let's talk a little bit about this roadmap. Essentially, at the very top of the list, as you can imagine, was to burn the Codex with the fire of 1,000 suns. But we weren't going to be able to do that until we had something to replace it, right? So up to this point, the Codex has been the primary entry point for developers and users. So in order to get those users away from the Codex, we would need to develop developer and support hubs, handbooks to replace the outdated and sometimes completely inaccurate information in the Codex, and of course, the hook documentation that we developed the standard for in the first place was starting in earnest. And that's the initiative I was brought in to help lead. So let's fast forward again a little bit to now. At this point, we have a home base on WordPress.org. We have 3 to 5 sub-teams under the docs team that's sort of handling all of these roadmap initiatives, like creating a developer hub or creating a support hub or working on the code reference theme or working on the custom parser that we need for our custom inline documentation spec, or working on hook documentation in core. And up to this point, we're even running some weekend sprints to sort of supplement our existing handbooks for theme and plugin developers. Because the point is that we have to create an alternative to the Codex before we can get rid of the Codex. So let's talk a little bit about where we are now, 8 months in. We very recently, with WordPress 3.9, completed documenting all the hooks in WordPress core. And that's 2,200 individual entities in the core code. So the interesting thing is, from start to finish, we essentially we saw a 48% increase of inline documentation in core in 3 versions. So we went essentially from like 65,000 lines of inline documentation to 99,000 in 3 versions. That's 1 year. And in that time, we saw something like 40 new first-time contributors. Those were just people working on inline documentation. And obviously, these are like patches. They're creating patches. So in addition to creating an inline documentation spec for how to write the hook docs, we had to create documentation for how to create patches, how to deal with subversion, how to how to download WordPress and run it on local. We had to create all this infrastructure just so that our contributors would be able to create patches and then submit those, because once they do that, then they're a accredited core contributor in WordPress. So the nice thing is that we had 40 new first-time contributors to WordPress just through the Hook Docs initiative. And overall, we had something like 85 contributors over the span of 3 releases, which is pretty neat. And, of course, the most exciting for me is that version 1 of the code reference launched a couple of weeks ago. Now, it's not the greatest thing in the whole world, but it's parsed, and we get all kinds of free stuff from it, which is awesome. The best part, of course, is that we only have to do something once. We just really need to make sure that someone's paying attention on the inline documentation front. And that was really the major difference between what we have now and what we had before, was that it's not that we weren't writing inline documentation, it's that no one was paying attention to the details. So more often than not, what we would have is they would add documentation with the code, but it would be incomplete, or it would be not necessarily inaccurate. It would just be, I think somebody yesterday was saying wrong docs are better than no docs. That's basically WordPress core in a nutshell in a lot of cases. It's not so much that they were wrong, it's that they were almost to the point of useless without all of the necessary information. So now that we actually have an inline documentation team in place, which by the way is sort of a hybrid team. We're half core, half docs team, but we report to the docs team. So it works out amazingly well. Now that we actually have an inline documentation team paying attention, we can actually move forward with documenting WordPress. So some takeaways from this is that developing a standard was obviously beneficial to us. It just took us a little bit longer than most projects to realize that. The other thing, and I was describing this to someone yesterday, I think the guy from Twitter, after he was talking about that insane 60,000 page wiki that they're dealing with. It's funny because in the end, our codex is going to end up being one giant 301 redirect. All of the function reference pages and all of those sort of code-related references that are in the codex will be manually redirected to their code reference counterparts very soon. It also allowed for longer-term consistency. I mean, obviously, essentially what we did was we took the 10 years of code and documentation that we had already and then developed a standard from that. And so there was some deviation from the sort of standard, PSR 5 spec or whatever with regards to how we handle documenting certain things or whether certain PHP doc tags are actually deprecated. But in the long term, it allows us to sort of adopt newer parts of the spec into our own spec so that we don't create that much of a bridge between the two. The point really is to say, we have this really unique thing in WordPress, and we want to make sure that we can document it effectively, but we don't want to deviate so far from the standard standard PHP spec that people don't know how to do it, that they have to read our spec to understand how to do it. The point is that we added our own sort of flavor, but generally speaking, it's the same sort of spec as everyone else is using already. And of course, it brought the docs team more to equal footing. I think the great Jennifer Hodgson last year, she's the Drupal docs committer, was talking about how they created the core gates in Drupal to sort of enforce that missing docs is a bug. That if you don't have documentation, it's not ready yet. I think the guys from Twitter were talking about this yesterday. If it doesn't have documentation, it's a bug, and that's really where we're coming from at this point. Is that in our issue tracker, it is a bug. It's a bug. If there's no documentation, it's a bug. And with that, I'm done. Questions?
So I have one as I'm going to walk back is, what kind of response did you get from people when you, especially engineers, when you say not having docs is a bug? Like, what do they say to that?
Could you say that again? I'm sorry.
What is the response from the devs when you say not having docs is a bug?
Honestly, it's been a pretty good response. You know, part of it is that I'm a core contributor already, so I'm sort of in there already, and they already know me. So when I tell them this isn't done until I say it's done, then they sort of understand that. It also helps that I'm paying attention all the time, so that if a commit does go through and they forgot, then I kindly remind them and reopen the ticket. It's sort of a mommy situation, but you know, honestly, it was received quite well. I think it was just mostly saying this is part of the core coding standards now, and this is something you need to keep track of now.
So in addition to using it as a bug, do you also have it as a part of the definition of done for new projects?
Yeah, I mean it's now the standard. So it's basically, you know, I'll use hook docs as an example. Now, if a hook is added to core, it has to have documentation with it. It's absolutely not ready to be committed without documentation. And this is, I should just mention, this is because our parser is actually parsing the code base once a day. We have it pointed at our nightly build, so it's actually parsing once a day now.
I have a question about, it's a more theoretical question, but your talk made me think of it, and I was thinking of it during a lot of the presentations yesterday, too. There's a bit of a debate out there on some of the blogs about the merits of what people call, wrongly, I think, manually created documentation versus generated documentation. Really, that's kind of a presentation issue. The question has to do, to my mind, more with content, but do you have thoughts about this? I mean, I think your answer is implicit in the presentation, but I was wondering if you could sort of pull it out and address it. Because, well, I'm starting to think there's arguments on both sides, even though I do also have an opinion.
Well, and honestly, you know, one of our biggest worries in moving from manually curated content to something that was parsed was that we would actually end up with something that was less informative. And in some cases, I think that that's actually true, and we've built in mechanisms so that we can manually curate content that's parsed. So basically, on the display end in our code reference, we have the ability to manually edit and manually add information without messing with what comes in from the parser. You know, and the other benefit really is that now that we're hooked up to parsing this code reference once a day, I can make a change in core today that shows up tomorrow. So it's amazing. You know, before we used to have to wait 3 months in between changes. It was crazy. It was like, you know, you just add it to the checklist, and then when the next version comes around, then you add it. It's nuts to do it that way. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Drew.